Ladies and gentlemen, good morning and welcome to this webinar, COVID-19, It's Budget Time, the Epic Review, brought to you by Johnston & Associates Chartered Accountants. My name is John Maybury and I'll be your facilitator for the next hour. Shortly we'll introduce to you our panelists, but remember that our first webinar last week addressed the wage subsidies, what you need to know and how to prove you're eligible, loan schemes, what to consider and how to plan taking on debt, the NZTE grants, what's available and how to access them, and finally, the best sources to get the right information for your business. But for the next hour, we want to address the four biggest issues that have come out of the recent budget. Our panelists will do a 7-minute discussion of what the budget outcomes mean for you and your business, and then we'll introduce our guest today, Westpac senior economist Michael Gordon, to get his view on the budget. This will be followed by a Q&A. We'll start with questions posed at registration, but if you have a question in the live webinar, even if it's not specific to the budget, please familiarize yourself with the dashboard panel on the right-hand side of your screen. There's a question area. Please put your question in there. Those questions will come through to me and we'll fire them off to our panelists and our guest in the Q&A. If we miss your question, we will come back to you after the webinar. At the end, we will announce 3 lucky attendees who will win an Epic beer pack, a 6-pack of your favorite Epic beers. Thank you to Epic for your ongoing support. Let's get underway, folks. Our first panelist is Mark Davies. Mark is the leader of Johnston & Associates Specialist Tax Advisory Team. He has 30 years specialist tax experience, from multinational and large corporates to family-owned groups and SMEs. He and his team are adept at dealing with a wide range of issues and tax opportunities, ranging from proactive restructuring advice aimed at asset protection, commercial and tax efficiencies, to managing complex IRD audits. Our second panelist, Logan Granger, has worked as a chartered accountant for over 20 years and became a director of Jackal in 2006. Logan and his team work in the area of advisory boards, business strategy and mentoring, due diligence, business sales, acquisitions, and much, much more. Logan likes to use his extensive network of good contacts to help clients resolve problems and make the most of opportunities. So let's dive into the budget discussion with Mark and Logan. Logan, let's start with you. What are the key takeaways for business owners from the budget?
Look, thanks there, John. Just covering up a couple of things. Just want to quickly mention that before we head into this one, next week we're going to look at leadership planning and execution, and we're hoping to have former New Zealand Sevens captain DJ Forbes, who's completed a PhD in leadership, available. So next week's seminar is going to be on leadership planning and execution, and we're hoping to have DJ Forbes, so don't miss that. Just to quickly recap from like John said last week, have a look at those small business lines. Make sure you're aware of what's sitting in there. Don't forget your support lines, not just financial, but trusted advisors. Those things are critical. Have a look at the wage subsidy, especially around the wage subsidy extension. Don't forget your audit parameters, reinforcing that information that you should have saved or preserved, and then having a look at your position now. The grants, one of the key things, that first grant that was related to the COVID from NZTE, it's pretty much dried out. There was $25 million available, and the businesses have accessed it. So while you're sitting there thinking that $25 million is a huge amount of money, I've got to slow down. John will be nagged with me now. But while you think this $25 million is a huge amount of money, look, it's just when a lot of people are accessing that pool, it runs out quick. So what I really want you to do when you're thinking about the things that we're talking about today, can you please just take the view that you need to register and you need to access. The first thing you need to do is find out how to register, and register so that you're engaged with the supplier or the provider of that assistance. The longer you leave that bit, the harder it's going to be to get it, and people are going to be ahead of the queue. So remember that. So we've got that. So let's rip into the budget itself. Look, there was $50 billion spent. It was a record. There's been, we think some of the key points for you are there's $20 billion in reserve. And we're going to look at potentially what that means, because there's still more stimulus there. We're going to look at some of those aspects around the wage subsidy. We'll talk about that, the extension to it, how that'll work. Jobs and training, like a massive focus of this budget is jobs and training and moving people around the economy. So they know that some industries aren't going to have jobs. They know that people are going to need to be repositioned into the economy in different places, or they're going to have to change jobs and retrain. So a huge factor in this budget is trying to keep a lid on unemployment, and they know that that's going to be a big task. So some aspects of the budget are pretty vague, I get that, but I think one of the key takeaways from you is, well, what do you do about retraining? What do you do with your workforce? How do you look at apprentices and those kind of things, people you can train up? Infrastructure and housing is another big one. Remember, it might not directly affect your business, but you might be somewhere in the supply chain for that, or related to somebody that's in the supply chain. So you need to think broadly about how you can take advantages of that. And then I think we've got a catch-all number 4, which is the COVID Response and Recovery Fund. And there's a lot of smaller elements in there that we can have a look at for you. So, you know, I think the key thing to kick off with is that, you know, $50 billion is a lot of money. Crown debt's going to probably exceed $60 billion. And going through that, our current debt relative to GDP is around about 19%, and it's going to go 50 plus. But also bear in mind that the entry points for the US and some of these other economies like Japan, China, Australia, they're already well over 50% of debt to GDP, right? So they're way ahead of us in terms of their entry point. So we're not going in at a high entry point compared to some economies. So while we're going to borrow a lot, it might not be as bad for us in some senses, but Michael Gordon will touch on that with us. I think the other thing is, if we come into some of the key parts of it, we'll look at infrastructure. I mean, that's another big area. They've got a $12 billion spend. They've already announced an extension of another $3 billion. We'll look at some of the capacity constraints around that. The infrastructure spending, whilst it's a big ticket item and it's a lot of money, I don't know if it's that easy to spend and spend efficiently. So, and they've always had some difficulty, and that's not just the Labor government, it's past governments, actually efficiently getting through that spend and delivering infrastructure. I'd like to probably hand over now to Mark, and he'll just cover the next line items.
Yeah, thanks, Logan. Look, one of the big ticket items announced was an extension to the wage subsidy scheme, which many of you will be, no doubt, quite familiar with. Look, it's a little bit different. This extension, it's almost like a second scheme as opposed to a continuation of the first one. It's 3-point-something billion they're expecting to spend on this. It doesn't say as much, but it's effectively targeted at those very worst affected sectors of the economy, because to be eligible, one of the criteria that you're going to have to meet is that you've had at least a 50% decline in revenue over a month versus the same period last year. So any business that suffers that level of revenue decline is you know, really hurting. So it looks as if that's really targeted at sort of hospo, tourism, probably a few other sectors, but certainly the very worst affected sectors. There's also, some of these amounts are small in comparison, but they're actually still quite big spends. There's additional assistance through the NZTE mechanisms for exporters to try and help them. There's a loan scheme being developed with about $150 million tagged to it. Now that's targeted at people undertaking R&D projects which are considered to be at risk of being discontinued because of disruption due to COVID. So yeah, R&D is something that we hear about a lot, and we continually get told that New Zealand lags international indicators in terms of its R&D spend as a percentage of revenue or as a percentage of profits. And the government's obviously quite keen to keep that activity happening, which I think is a very sensible move, and yeah, arguably could have more money thrown at it. So we've got a loan scheme kicking off in June around that, and there's a bit of money being thrown around it sort of at businesses, trying to help them grapple with digitization, e-commerce platforms and that sort of thing, which, as we've seen in recent weeks, are incredibly important when your normal channels can't be used for sales or purchases, etc. Tourism's another big ticket item. Logan, you're going to talk about that.
Yeah, thanks. Look, Mark, I tend to agree with you on these we want to recap here as a point we want to hammer home that Mark's just raised is there's 150 million, there's 10 million, there's a series of assistances there for exporters that sort of not really defined, but in our view, they're not big numbers, they're not big amounts of money. And I'm a little bit disappointed that they're not bigger at the get-go. Well, actually, I'm a lot disappointed probably because it's really tough for SMEs as it is. And these kind of things are kind of very, very critical. I think the key point to that is I'm kind of hoping that some of that reserve fund's going to come into that area and they're going to start targeting it, because like $10 million to look at helping people convert to digital, I just can't see how on the face of it that's really going to meaningfully make a difference at the ground level. So we're going to push back on that one a little bit. There's got to be some stuff. Mark, you wisely said, and I thought it was really interesting, it's not just about how much you spend, it's how well you spend it. And I think that's very, very interesting. Look, the tourism area's got 400 million, and a lot of that's to do with the fact that the tourism industry and the hospitality type industries, they're really going to struggle, and a lot of it's going to be about them sort of moving down. There's going to be too many people competing with too few people wanting to take it. So a lot of that's going to be about jobs, redeployment, those kind of things, maybe preserving some very key infrastructure points that they think are going to be required in 24, 36 months. The word on the ground is that a lot of overseas travel is just not going to return very quickly. So I think that there's those kind of things. There's a really big push around that lagging area of housing, which migration's really contributed to. So perhaps not having as many people floating around the economy and migration quite as high will give us a chance to catch up on some of that lag. Mark, perhaps just whipping back to you quickly to close off with environment and health before we get into Michael.
Yeah, environment's got a big ticket item attached to it as well in terms of the spend. They're talking $1.1 billion around certain environmental projects. Well, they haven't defined the projects, but that's things like planting of trees, pest eradication. They haven't talked about it, but perhaps this is sort of in line with the pest-free 2050 type vision that was put out there by the previous government. But an extra $1.1 billion for that, and they're talking about 11,000 jobs created out of that spend. Now, what they haven't said is, are they going to be permanent jobs or are they going to disappear after a year or two? We don't know, but certainly for the time being, 11,000 jobs is going to be of some assistance given what's projected to happen to unemployment levels. And health as well. Health is one of those big ticket items every budget. There's even more being thrown at it this year. Some of that stuff's related to COVID. Other parts of the spend would have happened anyway, but there's extra money for elective surgery, which was put on hold during the COVID sort of lockdowns. There's about an extra 300 million for that. There's more money for mental health. There's more money for helping people with disabilities. So massive spend every time round on health, and even bigger this time.
Yeah, I think just in closing on that, before we move across to Michael Gordon, look, one of the really big areas around this is sustainability. And before they'd really got into any issues with COVID, the government and the economy, there was a lot of moves around sustainability, the environment, cleaning up waterways, talking about all those kind of things. And I think this is a chance to really probably push that agenda a bit. And I'm all for it. I'm all sort of, the environment's a pretty big ticket item for me in terms of, generally the wellness of where you are, how they do that and whether or not they're doing it the right way. Again, I think that some of that $20 billion that's not been earmarked specifically could probably do these jobs a little bit better. I'm not entirely sure that the way they've done that environment fund, like you said, is short-term jobs and just getting people to plant trees. If that's what it is, there's other elements to that could really kickstart some innovation around that sort of stuff. So, look, John, can we head across to Michael, please?
Thank you very much, Logan. Thank you for that analysis. Time to introduce our guest today from Westpac, senior economist Michael Gordon. Michael has been part of Westpac's economics and strategy team since 2006. His responsibilities in that time have included currency and interest rate strategy, coordinating the team's inflation, growth and financial market forecasts, and conducting research in areas such as the labour market, house prices and macro-prudential policy. Previously, Michael worked at the Reserve Bank of New Zealand as a senior analyst in the Financial Stability Department. Now, Michael, Westpac chief economist Dominic Stevens says on his profile that he's crossed Mongolia on horseback. What do you do in your spare time?
Nothing quite so exotic and exciting as that. He also doesn't detail the exotic diseases he's picked up along the way on his travels. In my spare time, I like to play a little guitar. I played it since I was a teen. Lot of rock and metal. I know I'm probably the least metal-looking guy that you'll find, but you know, everyone has their sort of hidden depths.
That's awesome. Hey, look, I'd like to just start off with 20 billion that's been held back in reserve. What that means, you know, it's this unknown floating sum of money at the moment, like the why, the how, potentially what will happen with it. You know, just a little bit of a chat around that 20 billion that's sitting there at the moment.
Yeah, it's really notable from the budget. A lot of this stuff is happening very quickly, and a lot of it was at the last minute. So not a lot of detail on where a lot of the money is going to be spent. In fact, it really struck me that you had Treasury prepared its economic forecasts under the assumption of about $35 billion of COVID rescue money. So that's including the 12 billion that they had first rolled out in March, and then some extra. And what it looks like happened is that the government saw these forecasts. They saw that resulting in forecasts of unemployment still around about 6% a couple of years out from now. So even as we're getting past the worst of the big spike, still holding up at fairly high levels. And it really looks like they looked at those predictions and said, you know, this government does not find that kind of outcome acceptable. So they threw a lot more money at it, and we ended up with a total of $62 billion being devoted towards the kind of response and recovery track. So again, that's the 12 that was announced back in March, and then there's 50 more, some of which has been allocated. There's still this $20 billion that is there to be dished out at some future point. So it might be future budgets. It really could be any time in between as well, though, because things are having to move quickly. It's not unusual practice to have that kind of unallocated fund, particularly when it comes to infrastructure spending. They tend to have several $billion that are sort of budgeted to spend on this, but they figure out the actual projects further down the track. It's just the amount that's being unallocated is quite unusual at this point. And I think that a lot of that just reflects the fact that we don't really know what's the best way to spend that money at this point. But I think in terms of trying to guess at it, you know, Grant Robertson called this the jobs budget, and he wasn't kidding. This idea of the package of this size is to try to get a faster increase in unemployment. They have this ambition of getting the unemployment rate down to about 4%, around about its current level, within 2 years. I suspect that's probably too ambitious, because we're not really talking about the economy as a whole being back on track within 2 years, and unemployment does tend to lag the broader cycle. But that's where their ambition lies. If you're trying to guess at where the new announcements are going to come from, it's going to be about creating jobs, whether that's supporting businesses to create jobs, or if it's just direct government job creation. There's already a bit of that, a bit of both in this year's budget, and I think they will be continuing to push that angle.
Okay, so yeah, so it is definitely job centric, isn't it? And then, so what you're really saying too is that because it's a really unique environment and we don't really know what the outcomes are going to be, there needs to be some kind of fund that will respond to other parts of this process as we get into it.
Yeah, I mean, it would be nice if they don't end up having to spend that full amount if we get a stronger recovery than expected. But that said, the finance minister has said that, you know, they are going on the assumption that they would spend the full amount, and those projections for government debt are based on the full amount. So the economic forecasts are a bit softer. They haven't quite caught up, but the projections of getting up to net government debt of over 50% of GDP after 5 years, for instance, from about 20% today, that's based on them spending the full 62 billion. They just haven't figured out how they're going to get that amount out the door yet.
Okay.
So, Michael, how do you see this recovery panning out? So we're being told that this is not going to be like the GFC. It's going to be sort of a different shape in terms of in a graphical sense, short and sharp. Presumably, well, the hope is with a quick rebound. How do you see, in general terms, this sort of playing out in terms of the depth of the downturn, the length of the downturn, and how quickly we might see a rebound?
Well, there's a lot of sort of letters and symbols thrown around for what recoveries can look like. So people talk about a V-shaped recovery, so that's down and up very quickly. There's W-shaped, so kind of double dips, or there's U-shaped or dish-shaped. There's L-shaped. There's Nike swoosh-shaped. I'm going to throw a new one out there, and it's a bit complicated, but it's a backwards square root. So if I get this right, so we've sort of been tracking along, sharp dip here. I've gone off the screen. Coming back, but not all the way, and then maybe flattening out a bit from there rather than continuing to grow. So what we'll get is during that downturn, that's going to be off the charts steep. Yeah, that's reflecting the lockdown period when just a lot of businesses couldn't operate. So in terms of how the recovery looks like, I think the first stage of recovery will be potentially very fast. We could probably reclaim about 4/5 of that drop just by letting people get back to work. So letting businesses reopen, letting people outdoors to go and spend again. And it's reclaiming that last 1/5 of it or so that could prove to be quite stubborn and slow. Now where that last 1/5 or so, this is just approximate, but where that last sort of segment comes along is one, the closure of international borders. That's likely to be, you know, the last stage of this by quite a long margin, and we can't really control the timing of that because it just reflects how quickly the rest of the world gets it under control. And we've seen, you know, in a lot of the northern hemisphere, they have just let it get out of hand, and you know, that will take a long time to get infections in check. We can't control the timing for a vaccine or any antivirals that might be able to sort of deal with this on a mass scale. So realistically, I think we're talking about at least, if not complete, then at least partial closure of international tourism for it could be several years. And even when the borders reopen, whether people will be ready to get back into long haul tourism, which is more of a sort of premium product anyway. We saw that after the GFC. Long haul tourism took much longer to come back than shorter distance trips. Another part of it is sort of what does this do to the economy in terms of a supply side shock or a productivity shock. So certainly in the near term, we're probably feeling it now, even under level 2 and maybe even under level 1, the need to maintain things like social or physical distancing, I think is the better term. Just means that businesses just won't be able to operate as efficiently as before. So if you're a retailer, you're still having to keep customers 2 meters apart, or you can only let 2 into a store at a time, and then you don't have the space outside to maintain queues, so you're turning people away. You have to keep your employees distant as well. It just adds to the cost of doing business, and you just can't ramp up very you know, as well as you'd like. Longer term, there might be issues around what does this do to supply chains. So if there's a move away from kind of the globalized supply chains that we've seen develop over past decades, and maybe more of a focus on self-sufficiency, that may or may not serve you well in the next pandemic. I suspect it actually wouldn't, but a lot of people seem to have the idea that that's the lesson from it, is we need to produce local. But if you do that, you're still talking producing less efficiently. And in particular, if you are competing in the international markets, if you're an exporter, you know, you're putting yourself at a cost disadvantage compared to other countries that may not go down that track. But we really don't know how that'll pan out. But this is an interesting one because there is very much a productivity shock aspect to this as well. Are we going to go to slower, more cautious, less efficient business practices from here?
I think it's really interesting, and I'd like people to be able to get their head around that as a key takeaway, is that it's just hard to be like, it's just not as easy, you know, like you can't get as many people in stores, they can't get their supplies, you know, you could have stock outs, and it's, people think about it they always think about it from their perspective, they think about it from their shop or their shopping, where they're going, when it's actually there's a series of events that can occur before that that magnify the problem?
Yes, so I mean, take I guess sort of with retail, for instance, we're getting, we're seeing more stores are sort of ramping up their online capability, and that's, that may be more helpful in terms of getting to the customer, and maybe that'll accelerate that existing trend. You've still got things like further down the supply chain, so the manufacturer that produces your product or the warehousing and distribution, if they're having to maintain physical distancing and their practices are becoming slower and more costly, then you're still not escaping completely from this productivity hit. So I think some businesses will be more nimble than others, and this crisis probably will accelerate the move towards online, but there's still a big sort of chunk of the economy that does require, it's either physical goods or it really does pay to be in close contact. I think, for my part, I've certainly found that, in the workplace, we'd be having a lot of sort of really quick conversations, and doing those by phone or by email just makes them take 3 times longer. I think for my part, I would much prefer to be in the office with people. And more broadly, I think it's hard to predict how this will go, and I think there's been predictions in the past that you'll see a move towards people working from home, and that'll sort of see people moving out to the suburbs because they won't have to go into the offices and so on, and you'll get this sort of outflow of people from the cities. Actually, what the opposite has happened, because people have discovered the importance of what's called agglomeration effects. There's actually sort of non-linear gains from being in close contact, not just with your colleagues, but also being close to your suppliers, close to your competitors even. So what's actually happened is that the benefits of being within the city centre have actually proven to be much greater than people thought, and that sort of flight out of the CBD, actually the opposite has happened. It sounded like a good prediction. There was sound reasoning for it. It's not what actually happened, and I'd be sort of cautious about sort of saying that we'll kind of see that sort of flight towards remote working out of this crisis.
Okay. Can we pivot across to the labour market, job preservation, job creation, redeployment, unemployment, the hospitality and tourism sector? I know there's a big, we're talking about, I mentioned a big framework of things there, but overall the labour market and that whole area, how do you see that, the movement of labour through the market, the cost of doing that, and the retraining, those sort of programs that they're looking at? I think, it's a jobs budget. Can you give us a bit of an idea of what you think around those areas?
Yeah, that kind of, I guess, sort of restructuring the labour market, it's very difficult. And I think in one sense, this might be one way that we look a bit more like the sort of the peak in unemployment in the early 1990s, where it got to about 11%, I think, unemployment. And that was sort of following the upheavals of Rogernomics and the continuation on in the mother of all budgets, and sort of a real shrinkage of the government sector. A lot of, whole industries and whole employers just disappeared and didn't come back. And that kind of being able to sort of shift the makeup of the workforce towards the sectors that were, growing and so on, took a long time. How long did it take? I don't think that we've even completed that process yet. So, we're talking almost 3 decades to sort of, it took 3 decades almost to get unemployment down to 4%. And then this came along and blew it all up. So I think there will be an element of that as well. The sort of tourism and hospitality related areas, they're obviously in the firing line, because the international aspect of it is going to be quite heavily restricted for some time. And just the number of tourism related businesses that we have is just, is not going to be viable. Some will survive, but not all of them. Not all the current ones will be able to keep going. So how do we, create new businesses for them? There's a bit of funding for that, a bit, a few billion here and there. It starts to add up, but there's some devoted towards that in the budget. But it's difficult to force it. So one of the aspects is some funding for trade and apprenticeships, and that probably will be taking people out of the tourism-related areas. Where's it going to go into? I mean, it sounds like they're looking at a lot of that being in construction, because there is an upping of the infrastructure spending program. There's also this increase in public housing. So there's sort of certainly jobs to be created there in the near term. Longer term, I mean, construction is one of the most cyclical industries. So long term, it might be out of the frying pan into the fire for some of these people. But as a sort of a near-term effort to try and avoid a sustained period of unemployment, it's understandable that they're pushing in that direction.
How do you see, there's been talk of trans-Tasman bubbles and things like that, Michael, which for some people might be a really important part of any recovery for their business. How do you see that side of things sort of playing out?
It's a sort of opportunity that's come up unexpectedly. One thing you have to bear in mind is that we weren't expecting to be doing this well in terms of suppressing the case numbers. The projections that were made as we went into lockdown was that under extreme lockdown conditions, we might be able to get case numbers down to maybe 30, 40 a day, and it just the idea is to not have them growing exponentially, but rather sort of settling at a manageable level. So we weren't really expecting to get down to zero or near zero. And the same thing with Australia. They haven't got down fully to zero, but they weren't expecting to get the numbers as low as they have. So that's opened up this little window of opportunity where maybe we can expand the bubble to incorporate Australia, and then looking at other countries where the numbers are in check. So maybe you can include Taiwan, maybe South Korea, depends how they go. We should probably look at the Pacific Islands as well, because we sort of really need to think about two-way tourism. But one thing to bear in mind is that doesn't require zero case numbers. We don't have to be completely eradicated. What we do need is just systems in place to be able to keep the number of cases manageable, which is after all, what we were really already aiming for. So having extensive testing capacity, having rigorous contact tracing, those are things that we didn't have in place as we went into lockdown, and that's why we had to go to the extremes of the lockdown. Because I think our government, and certainly many governments, were slow to sort of appreciate the importance of something like contact tracing for this particular virus, where you can catch people before they develop symptoms. So now that that capacity is in place, we don't have to aim for zero forever. There's a level of spread that's low but tolerable, and that sort of opened up this possibility that maybe we can open up our bubble across countries, except that there's going to be some increased risk of infection out of that, but realizing that we have systems in place to try and minimize that risk.
I think you said originally that a lot of the models were based, sort of our response models were based on things like the flu, and this is vastly different because of the gestation period, and it took some time for government and other people to actually understand how you can effectively manage that. I think you see the initial trend of it, and it's a bit out of control, and it looks like that because they don't have they just haven't adapted a system to manage it, compared to say some of those Asian countries that had gone through those other COVID-related viruses firsthand.
Yeah, so our pandemic plan was based around the Spanish flu effectively, but an influenza type virus, you tend to develop symptoms very quickly. So with that kind of outbreak, it's, again, this is sort of my understanding of the reading of it, but with a flu type outbreak, contact tracing is wasted effort, because people get sick before you can track them down. With this one, it's quite unusual. There's this longer incubation period where you can track people down and tell them to isolate before they realize that they may be spreading it. And you can sort of, in that case, it's a worthwhile investment. But our current plan wasn't set up for that. I suspect that the countries that went through SARS in particular were prepared more for that possibility. So that's sort of part of the secret of something like South Korea's response in terms of getting their outbreak under control very quickly. So that has been ramped up. Now there's still work to be done on it, but the thing is that we didn't have that in place in late March, and so we didn't really have any alternative other than the short, sharp lockdown. We're better placed now to deal with any sort of pickup in cases. I mean, hopefully, we don't have to deal with that, but it's a question of risk management, really. This is, the optimal number of cases is not necessarily 0. It's nice that we did get there, but there's a level of spread that's manageable if you have the right systems in place, and that's the world of South Korea and Taiwan and so on. They're not at 0, but they're at very low manageable levels.
I guess that's the key thing. We're not trying to get into the epidemiology of it. We're just saying, look, in order for these things to work, we've got to get a mindset shift around systems and procedures, that we went in with one scenario, we're developing systems and procedures, and we've got to reorientate ourselves to facing it as another scenario.
Yeah, I think in this case it's just it's an unexpected bonus that's cropped up. I think we were sort of really looking to get case numbers sort of low and steady. Turns out we got to 0. That's fine, but I think in terms of reopening in the economy, it doesn't require us to maintain 0.
Cool.
So there's been talk, Michael, in some quarters around whether this is a good reason for New Zealand to probably be more isolationist in its view and more self-sufficient, so that we can sort of create, in essence, sort of create barriers and prevent so much downside or so much damage being done from similar events in the future. Any views on that?
Yeah, there's I think there's certainly people that will say the lesson from this crisis is da da da, and it happens to be the thing that they were advocating for before the crisis. But we already had a global sort of retreat from globalization, effectively. It's not something that began this year or began with Trump. Really, since the GFC, there's been this steady creep of increase in trade barriers, and mostly non-tariff barriers. So that kind of sort of retreat away from global supply chains had already begun. It did really accelerate under Trump, and now you've got sort of people saying, well, the lesson of this is that we need to rely on domestic supply chains. We can't risk being beholden to Chinese suppliers. Personally, I don't think that's the right lesson to draw from this. I mean, firstly, in terms of pandemic preparation, how would it have helped us to have all our manufacturing done domestically when we had to shut most of those manufacturers down? That didn't solve the supply chain issues. Longer term, I mean, I think we are an export-heavy nation. We do benefit from a world that is open to trade. So while we would like to think that out of this that we should be sort of really pushing exports, because agriculture sort of remained open, food manufacturing remained open because it was considered essential to earn export dollars. We would sort of like the rest of the world to keep their markets open to us. At the same time, are we going to sort of advocate for import substitution, so producing things more locally? If the whole world thinks like that, then it doesn't add up. You can't have everyone saying we're going to export more and import less, because who's going to be buying your exports? So I think we need to maintain the idea of keeping supply chains open. The other side of it is just an efficiency issue. One of the things I've mentioned is that if we do see this move towards more domestication, that just means doing things in a costlier way. And on international markets potentially makes us less competitive. So if we go down that road and some other country doesn't, we lose competitiveness to them. So it's not entirely our choice as to whether we go for a local production strategy.
Michael, do you think the government understands that? Like that's got to be a key metric at most of the places around Treasury and government. They'd get that. Any government would get that. It wouldn't matter whether you're Labor or National, right?
Yeah, I mean, it's there'll be certain characters who have sort of advocated the domestication line for a while, but I think the government as a whole sort of understands the importance of keeping international trade open. So I think we may well get a shift towards local production of really essential stuff like medical supplies. You don't want to be caught out in the next coronavirus. And bearing in mind we've had 3 really bad human coronaviruses in less than 20 years. So don't think of this as being a once in a century event. This might be something that we're sort of having to keep dealing with several times within our lifetimes. But you don't want to be caught out in terms of your masks and ventilators and so on. But a broader move towards saying that plastic manufacturers have to be they have to be doing it locally rather than overseas. There's no strategic reason for that. It's just really it's just choosing to do things in a costlier way.
You kind of had a really good analogy too. I think that we talked about it before we came on air about how some parts of the supply chain and what we rely on to manufacture goods locally, they're hard baked into the system. We can't just substitute them out. It's not that easy. You were saying, like, I think you talked about the flour, and it wasn't so much the production of flour, it was just there's no bags to put it in.
Yeah, it's something that especially came up during the earlier stages of the lockdown. So, I mean, hopefully we are past the worst of that, but it was the sort of difficulty of defining essential businesses. So it was one thing to say, supermarkets are essential because people have got to eat, but then you had things cropping up sort of further back in the supply chain. So, harmless enough ones, I guess, like we didn't have enough of the right size bags, the 1.5 kilo bags to sell flour in. So that's why there was, why there were shortages of flour on the supermarket shelves. It wasn't the product itself; it was the packaging that they didn't have enough of. But when you do go into lockdown, the longer you stay in it, the harder it is to predict what's essential, because you have essential business here, but then they have suppliers, they have distributors, and so on. And if you say they're not essential, then the retailing business can't operate, even if they are allowed to. So it is really hard to make those predictions about, sort of identify those things about what are essential, what do we need to, have secure supply chains of if we do have another crisis. It's the kind of thing that the market works out for itself. The idea that there's someone central who can sort of create the list of who should stay open and who shouldn't. Even our brief taste of that just showed how laughable that was.
So you just touched on the markets, Michael. Everyone's probably sitting there thinking, so what does this mean for me in terms of interest rates, asset values, housing markets, etc., etc.? What do you think? What do you think lies ahead?
I think low interest rates are going to be a part of the mix of policy response for some time. The trouble that the Reserve Bank's been having is that they haven't been able to contribute as much as they would like. They've been hamstrung by the fact that their usual tool, the official cash rate, was already very low coming into this. It's debatable whether or not there's sort of a lower limit to how low it can go, but it certainly does become less effective once you get down to very low or even negative rates. So they've been struggling to sort of contribute in the way that they would like. Normally in a downturn, they would sort of like to act hard and then be able to sort of unwind the response as we return to normal. Because they haven't been able to go as hard as they like, it means that the medicine's going to have to be drip fed more slowly, and they're likely to be keeping policy easy for some time. They've also, I think, often sort of appealed for the need for both the monetary and fiscal side. So number one and number two, the tierists, to be both making their contributions, and certainly the fiscal side has certainly been dramatically ramped up in this case.
Okay.
Sorry, I think so. In terms of what that means for for businesses and or just households in general. I mean, low interest rates, I think, will be helping to support the housing market in the longer term. Near term, there's probably a bunch of forces arrayed against it. So we're thinking probably more of a dip in prices in this year and some recovery next year. What it means for, I guess, sort of borrowers and savers more generally. We have talked about the idea that the Reserve Bank's official cash rate could go negative to some degree. That's probably not going to mean negative interest rates for customers, so for term deposits or for mortgage rates or business lending rates and so on. It's really just a tool that they can use to try and get retail interest rates closer to zero. It's just a sort of way of bringing them down, because there's always this margin between the official cash rate and the interest rates that you and I tend to face. So in that sense, it's sort of operating as normal. They will be continuing to look for ways to bring customer interest rates down, and that's borrowing and deposit rates. Let's be clear about that. But in that sense, it's sort of more of the same of what we're used to, is trying to get those interest rates low, but still above zero. So that's going to mean, yes, it's cheaper to borrow. It does mean that, I think we'll see some sort of move away from deposits and people sort of looking for returns on their investments. That is actually part of the healing process. So if people do, if we do get a perkier housing market, or if you get people putting more money into shares and so on, funding businesses, then that is, that's not creating an asset bubble. That's actually one of the mechanisms that they have for trying to restart the economy.
Look, just before we whip into question and answers, which John will host, I just want to cover off. I just want to get one last question through that we wanted to cover, or one last area. And just to recap on that last one, we sort of think that interest rates are going to be encouraged to be kept low for 1 to 3 years. We're not hopefully going to see a massive spike in interest rates. I think coming into this, the getting out thing's the interesting thing. We're going to borrow all this money. How do we get out of here? We've talked about some elements of getting out, because we're going to have some inflation, perhaps growth, changes in tax, hopefully some efficiencies, and maybe changes to pensions. What getting out of here, very, very briefly, what does that sort of look like, Michael?
Yeah, it's going to have to be some combination, and I think it's worth noting that some of this was going to be happening anyway. I know it doesn't get talked about, outside of the one day of the year of the budget, when people suddenly become, deficit hawks. But for a long time, the long-term debt projections for New Zealand have noted that, as time passes, we get an older population. That over 65 segment just gets bigger and bigger and bigger over the decades. And if we stick with current spending plans, so current settings for superannuation, that spending's going to have to go up. Healthcare spending goes up a lot as well with an older population, and then there's all the existing programs. If you maintain the status quo for over the course of the next few decades, the projections were for government debt levels to really go explosive. So the lesson from that is that we couldn't do the status quo. Something's going to have to change. I think a lot of the time people just say, well, that's decades in the future. We've got time to deal with that. It's not really. It's starting now. It started when the baby boomers started to hit age 65, which was almost 10 years ago now when that started. So something's going to have to change, and it could be on the spending side. So it's not a question of is superannuation sustainable. It's whether the whole caboodle is sustainable. If we're not willing to make changes to super, what other kind of public services are we going to be willing to give up? It could be on the revenue side, so higher taxes of some sort. In fact, I think that it's inevitable that will happen. Again, governments don't like to talk about it; they don't like to scare the horses, but I think it is implicitly in the projections that's going to have to happen. You can try and grow your way out of the debt. So if the economy grows, then the debt to GDP ratio shrinks, all else equal. Within that, inflating your way out is actually a subset, because the government sort of thinks about, where do I get my tax revenue from? That depends on the size of the nominal economy, and you can grow that through increased activity, or you can grow it through inflation. And government's not necessarily too concerned about that, because they end up with more tax dollars one way or another. As individuals and as businesses, we probably do care a lot about the distinction. We really care about whether we're getting higher profits or increases in our living standards versus just a higher cost of living. So that is one of the options on the table. When we talk about grow our way out, it's not necessarily the kind of growth that you and I would like to see, but it's the kind of growth that would lead to higher tax revenue.
All right, John.
Thank you very much, Logan. Thank you, Michael and Mark. First question for you, one of our registration. A lot of commentary is a worldwide depression. Can this be avoided in New Zealand, and what are the implications for New Zealand? Short answer, Michael.
Not entirely. I mean, when we say worldwide depression, it's going to look Again, very much like that sort of steep, not quite a V shape, where the lockdown phase will look quite ugly. The bounce back will also be off the charts initially, but we're probably still not going to be getting the world back to the level of activity that we thought it would be previously. I mean, as I said, we can't control the timetable around how quickly the rest of the world gets the outbreak under control. I think we can do something in terms of the extent of the hit to New Zealand. So I think certainly, again, maintaining export markets is important. It's not a freebie because China's got their outbreak under control. Great, we've got it means their market is open to us, but they're going to be facing a weakened economy and weakened trading partners, so that'll hit their own incomes. So it's not a free ride for us in terms of being keyed into China there. We can do things in terms of minimizing what people call scarring, for want of a better word. The idea is that the longer that you have a period of high unemployment, those people out of work, they start to lose their skills, they start to kind of lose their motivation. And a lot of what the budget package was about was avoiding trying to avoid a period, or an extended period of high unemployment. That's again coming back to the finance minister's comment that this was very much a jobs budget. I think it's worthwhile. Can you put a price tag on it? So is it really worth an extra $20 billion of borrowing for future generations to have to deal with in order to reduce the unemployment rates by 2 percentage points? I don't know. I mean, it's as much a value judgment as a cost benefit one. But certainly that's the way that this government has leaned. They've said that high unemployment is not acceptable to them, and they're willing to spend the money on sort of minimising that to the extent that they can.
Excellent. Watching the live webinar is Scott Simmons, and he asks, what industries do you think are going to be important to New Zealand moving forward, and do you think the government is doing enough to support them?
I can sort of take that briefly, but I'm sure there might be other comments on that as well. I mean, businesses related to international tourism, I think, are the obvious ones that are going to be hard hit, because again, we can't control how quickly we open the borders. Even if we go for the Pacific bubble, that's still missing a fair chunk of our international tourism. So realistically, there's going to be a portion of that that's not going to be, it's going to be a long time before we're back to 3.5 million visitors a year that can sort of sustain the number of businesses we have. I mean, it will be interesting. I think we'll certainly, the crises tend to accelerate trends that were already in place. So I guess the move to online is probably likely to have been accelerated through this. Although, as we discussed earlier, that's only one leg of the supply chain. If you still have sort of physical production of the goods and so on, then you can't move everything into the digital space. There's still steps in there that are physical. One thing I would caution is there's been a few people saying that agriculture or food manufacturing came out of this well. It was considered an essential business and kept going. We kept getting export dollars from it. So therefore, this is the way of the future. We should be trying to get more people working in agriculture. I don't know that that's necessarily the true beyond the lockdown period. Bearing in mind, I think China itself, as I've mentioned, the market has stayed open or has reopened there, but they will be under pressure from their own incomes. They'll also be under pressure from the supply side. So European farmers, their domestic demand has disappeared, so they're going to be looking to offload product into China. I still think there's going to be some downward pressure on prices for things like dairy products, meat, logs, in the coming months. So this is not necessarily the way of the future. To be honest, I don't know that there's sort of whole sectors that will benefit out of this. It's really just kind of it's kind of a cruddy outcome for everyone, really. It's relative degrees of badness. I think looking more narrowly, I think there will certainly be businesses that are sort of will realise opportunities out of this, but it's sort of likely to be really getting down to the micro level rather than saying this industry is where we should be shifting the workforce to.
Excellent. Let's get in a few more questions if we can before we close out today. Thank you, Jenny Johnson, for your question. This one also in the registration It's very similar. What is in this budget that is good for small business with perhaps a few staff, but high upfront costs in product procurement? Gentlemen, Logan, Mark.
No, that's Mark.
Oh, thanks. Look, there are some bits and pieces that are directly targeted at small to medium businesses, and they range from extra NZTE funding for export-orientated businesses through to the money put towards assistance around digitisation of various things. Maybe the biggest thing, though, is actually the indirect effect of keeping people employed, of having wage subsidies, and keeping money flowing through the economy and hopefully people spending. In your particular situation, I can't think of anything that is directly targeted at the sort of circumstances that you're talking about, but indirectly some of the other measures I think might have quite a significant effect versus the alternative, where wage subsidies, for example, and the emphasis on keeping people employed and keeping those incomes flowing, if that wasn't there. So I don't know, probably not a lot of good news for you there, but I think there is certainly going to be some indirect benefit from what has been done in the budget. Having said that, I am personally of the view I think a lot more could have been done around targeting businesses specifically, and more money at R&D and things like that, but that's just my personal view.
I think maybe one of the questions there is really like, there's some companies whose balance sheets are really heavy with stock and procurement, and they really rely on stock turn to make that work. So they've got a lot of their businesses tied up in stock and stock movements or getting those components in. And again, right now, I can't see it. I can't see a lot there that's going to help those businesses that potentially have got a slowdown in sales, and basically that element that the person asked around, well, what's there for them, because they've got this cost that's sunk, it's stuck, and it's not easy to remove. I can't see that yet, but hopefully something will come up.
All right, we've got one more question before we close out at midday. Is now a good time to launch a social enterprise and provide positive employment and environmental outcomes? Logan?
Yep, I can cover that. Look, I like that question. It's interesting. And I think the thing is, like, I do a lot of work with Everybody Eats, which is a food waste charity which brings people together to have meals, reduce food waste, and it's a social enterprise. And the amount of work that actually goes into making that organisation work, getting that restaurant going, making it go, 5 nights a week. They've opened up to 2 now. Just the sheer logistics of doing that. So they're great ideas, but it's more than just a good idea. You've actually got to sit there and study your market. At the moment, a lot of charities, a lot of organisations, a lot of social enterprises are really going to struggle for funding, because where is it? Where's that? And philanthropy might make up some of it, but we don't know. So I wouldn't be thinking about starting a business like that unless you've got a very clearly articulated plan, a funding line that you know is going to come in for it, and you can sustain it and roll it out. So it's a great idea, but you have to have the substance that sits behind it. And I really like those ideas. I think that there's a need for it, there's an opportunity there, but you actually have to pre-plan for it. You actually have to know, okay, how much is it going to cost me? Where am I going to get my funding lines and my relationship from? How am I going to actually roll that out? So yeah, great idea, and I advocate for it, but again, there's a lot to it.
Okay, thank you so much to the people who put in some questions. We didn't get to you, but some of these questions can be answered by the Jackal team around the country. Mark McGill, thank you so much. David Dilliams, also to John Baker, Ethan Rubin, and Laurie. I think I saw you pop in there at the end. We need to announce our 3 lucky winners who have picked up an epic beer pack. It's an epic review. Simon Parkinson, Louise Harness, and Peter Moore. You're going to be loving some epic beer at your place. It's bloody brilliant. At the conclusion of this webinar, you will be sent an email with the actual recording. So feel free to share this with your other stakeholders or business colleagues. Also in that email will be a short survey, some questions about how we went and how we can better serve you in future webinars. We'd like to thank you for attending this session today. We hope you got some value. We're committed to giving you more value over the next few weeks with our next live and free webinar next Tuesday, 11 a.m. and we'll be addressing leadership and planning, as Logan said, with our special guest, former New Zealand Rugby Sevens captain DJ Forbes. And we will send those invitations out in due course. On behalf of all the team, Michael Gordon, Logan Granger, Mark Davies, and the entire Jackal team from around the country, north and south, I'm John Maybury. See you next Tuesday at 11 a.m. for the next webinar.
Just before we kill off, I know you've done that closeout. Can we just close off those key calls to action? Access all your assistance. Don't forget that, right? So all your assistance, financial and mentoring. Register for those assistance packages and find out where they are. Talk to your accountant or your financial advisor about where to go from those key budget headlines. Talk to your key stakeholders, even if you've already talked to them. Keep that dialogue up. That's your landlords, your suppliers, your customers. Things are changing. It's going to be fluid for the next 90 days. So you need to keep going through that stuff. Keep looking at where you're at today and where you're going. What does it look like today? What does your cash flow look like now? What's it going to look like? Remember that cash is still king. Use it wisely. I'm not saying don't spend it, but just make sure you're allocating it to the right areas for your business. And don't forget your trusted advisors. Again, keep going back there. They're there. You trust. Narrow that source of information down and go to the ones that you trust. Thanks very much for coming along.
Good, thanks team. See you next week, 11 a.m. Next Tuesday for our next webinar. Thank you again to Michael Gordon.
Yeah, thank you.